building and sustaining employment support services. Let's talk a little bit about that. Let's talk about what we're really trying to accomplish and see if we can't walk through some of the employment. Now, when we're talking about employment services, we're talking about competitive integrated employment. It's individualized. No two support situations are alike. And that helps drive us into what we're going to talk about with employers, what we're going to think about, and how we're going to structure our services. When we think about the team, we really want to make sure that we're identifying people that have the skill sets to deliver the services. We want to make sure that people know who they are, what they're doing, why they're doing it. And we really want to make sure that we continue to think about employer engagement. Employer engagement is really about building those relationships. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So whenever we start talking about it, I always like to talk about navigating the landscape. And I think it's important to use a term that I like to talk about when we start talking about employment services. And that's the business of doing business with businesses. Now, I've used the word business 3 times, and that's not an accident, and it's not bad grammar. I really want to make the point about all 3 types of business. We are doing a relationship with a business, and the business is in the service of delivering something to their customers and deriving a profit from it. So we are in the business of doing business with businesses when we start talking about employment services. In doing that, though, we have to realize that we live in 2 worlds. Our staff live in 2 worlds. They live the world of human services, where they sit around in IPPs, ISPs, ITPs, ILPs, and all the P's you can pee. And while we're peeing, we talk about what's wrong with people. And then we walk across the bridge. And as we walk across the bridge, even though the landscape looks the same on both sides, the rules are very different on the other side of the bridge. Because when we go out to talk to an employer, we don't want to talk about all the things that the person's struggling with. We want to talk about them being a contributing member to that workforce. And we don't use terminology that we do when we're sitting around peeing. We talk about, what contributing members, how efficiencies, helping with their workforce. We don't use diagnostic terms. We don't talk about process, of the programs or funding or the funding services. So we need to always be thinking about the 2 worlds of employment services when we start doing that, the world of human services and the world of business. As we design our organizations, we have to make sure that we put the right people in the right place. A lot of times in a small organization, one person does everything. And that's reasonable if we're only going to serve a small population of people. But the larger the number of people that we're providing services to, the more specialized it seems to be for the different roles. And one of the roles is talking to employers and building relationships and sustaining long-term relationships with employers. The others, getting to know the person, understanding interventions, understanding on-site supports. Now, there's a rare few people who can actually do both types of services, but in reality, we want to make sure that we're identifying that the person has both those skill sets, or we're carving it out for our staff. So we want to make sure that we design an organizational structure that bears fruit. And so let's talk a little bit about that. Managing a dynamic team. We talk a lot about who's on our team. One of the things that I really recommend for employment services teams is for each day, or at least weekly, all the members of the employment services team have a huddle, just a 5 or 10 minute huddle every day. Make sure everybody knows where everybody's at, what's going on. That keeps coordination. It keeps people engaged. We're going to talk a lot today about strategies that help us retain employees and help us retain people in their employment while they still want to be there. So the reality is that we want to think about managing the team all the time, and staff members need to be trained and communicated, and there needs to be a high level of communication. So in doing that, the huddle helps do that. Now, if you're only doing it weekly, I also recommend that as a supervisor, you try to schedule in about 5 minutes at the end of it where you do some element of training. You pick some component or some piece of the process and you walk through it, whether that's gap analysis, which we'll talk about later, or it's talking to an employer, or it's documentation. Those are the kind of trainings that we want to keep doing for staff on a regular basis. Even if they've heard it, it's always good to review it and keep doing it. So that's part of us thinking about our team. Now let's talk about the tools. One of the critical components of tools for our team is to make sure that they have employment, course, services, and training modules. What I mean by that is that if you hire a new staff person, we want to make sure that you bring them in, you train them, and they have a resource to keep going back and reviewing that training. It's written and it's consistent. It's not you get trained by your coworker. Training by the coworker is a lot like the game telephone. Have you guys ever played the game telephone, where you talk to one person and it goes all the way around the room? At the end, you go, where did that come from? And that's really what happens a lot when we start doing, training for colleagues without having training curricula, without having competencies. We also want to make sure that we have standard operating procedures. And the really good news is there's some organizations around who've already done a lot of work on standard operating procedures. So they're available and you can borrow them. Actually, the Employment First Office in Colorado actually is more than willing to share a whole set of standard operating procedures that they've developed. There's a really good place that's done a good job with that. We also want to make sure that the managers have training guides. It's real important that the managers become the insight subject matter experts for employment services to really be successful. It's good to send people out for training to network and maybe learn other things, but we shouldn't rely on external training for the development of our staff, because what sometimes happens is they'll go to an external training and they'll come back and it's not implemented, or it's not part of what the manager does or the way the manager does it. And now we have a series of wasted efforts. We have the effort of sending the person to the training, and we have the frustration of them coming back trying to implement it and not getting support for it. So we really want to make sure we have those guides for managers. We also want to make sure that we're using consistent tools. And I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes, why that's so important. But we want to make sure that our staff are using consistent tools from staff member to staff member to staff member, so that we don't have one person doing one set of things and another person doing another set within the same organization. I frequently, people say, what's the definition of employment services? And I've heard beautiful definitions, matching people, thinking about people, helping people get jobs. But the definition of employment services that I like the best is the management of chaos. And the reality is we have to understand that employment services is all about the change. The world changed, the people changed, things change, we think things change. It's all about that. So if we're working, and if that was what makes it dynamic and exciting for staff, but if we're working in a world of chaos, we need to make sure that we have the right tools to support us with the chaos. So today we're going to spend a lot of time talking about those tools and those processes. We also got to remember something out about employment services. Employment services are not an 8 to 5 situation. Now, we may work certain shifts, but support employment services is going on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, 366 during leap year, 365, 366 days a year. And we've got to make sure that we have the tools, processes, and practices in place to support people on a 24-hour basis. So employment services is not an 8 to 5 gig. So let's talk a little bit about employment now and the process of employment. Let's first talk about our customers, because that really sets the baseline for about everything else we're going to do. We have 3 primary customers in employment services. And the first customer that we have is the job seeker. Now, if I were to ask each of you what you look for from your job, you would all tell me certain things. There would be things like pay, benefits, reward, growth, opportunities to contribute. You'd give me a whole bunch of those. And for each one of you, you'd give me from the same ingredients some of the choices. But for each one of us, the recipe would be very different. And that's what we've got to understand about employment services, is it's a different recipe for every single person. And so we got to make sure we keep that in our mind, and we got to understand what a job seeker really wants from a job. Given their individualized recipe, though we may share ingredients from them, our recipe doesn't really matter to that person. It's their recipe. But from that, what the job seeker is looking for is a job where the rewards outweigh the crap stuff. And if the crap stuff starts taking over, person doesn't want to work there anymore. Now, it may start where it's not high, but by the time the person is settled into the job, there has to be more reward from the job than the crap stuff. And we frequently have people who will tell us they want certain types of jobs. And we have to be very thoughtful about that because a person wants a job, we have to make sure that we're building it in a way that the rewards outweigh the crap stuff. You know, we also, the worst thing we can ever ask a person is, what job do you want? Because once they give us a job title, everything goes downhill because job titles don't define jobs. So I really want to make sure that we understand that we're looking for the elements of a job, what the person's jazzed by, what makes sense to them. So when I talk about the recipe of the person, our job is to find out what that recipe is. Now, I also want to be clear about one other thing. I had a young man that we worked with, and you know, he said he wanted to be a pilot. Well, he had a visual impairment and some other issues, and he probably wasn't going to become a pilot, but it wasn't my job to tell him, because my job wasn't to determine whether to become a pilot or not. My job was to help him get from step A to Z. My job is to get him from A to B. And so my job is to help him find something that builds his skills on the way to what he's dreaming of and let him sustain that dream, because it's not my job to break dreams. And so we want to make sure that we're building that dream for the person along the way. You know, and by the way, if he wants to be a pilot, A to B is not cleaning the toilets at the airport. Okay, that's not on the road to becoming a pilot. So what we really want to think about is sustaining that dream, but just going from A to B. We don't have to get all the way to Z, and we don't have to go and tell him. He'll figure it out for himself. We all shift as we're figuring out what we want to do. So that's the job seeker. Now, the other customer we have is the employer. Now, what does an employer want from an employee? Now, right about now, I sit in a lot of trainings and people ask me the question, so why would an employer hire somebody who needs support when they can hire somebody who doesn't? I'm always really kind of interested by that comment, because having been a supervisor many times, I've never had anybody who worked for me who didn't need supports. Having been a employee, I've never been in a situation where I didn't need supports, and having been a colleague, I've never seen any of my colleagues who didn't need supports. So employers are not intimidated about supports. They are sometimes a little turned off by the concept of programs, and we'll talk more about that. But employers aren't turned off by supports. There's reasonable supports, and they're willing, in most often case, provide them all the time. But what does an employer want from the employment process? Well, a lot of people, again, in human services, and this is where that human services thing comes in, they'll say, somebody who can do the job. And again, that's really puzzling to me, because why would the employer hire somebody who couldn't do the job with or without supports? And why would we help somebody facilitate a job with or without supports that they couldn't do? So I don't think do the job is really the standard. I think the standard for an employer is the employer wants somebody who can contribute more than they cost. In fact, that's the definition of the employment relationship, is that somebody actually contributes more than they cost. Now, it doesn't always start that way, because when somebody new is hired, there's a lot of effort and you invest in the person. But over time, they have to be, and it doesn't have to be a big margin. It just has to be a margin. And that's why the employer's in business. In fact, that's the definition of the employment relationship, is I'm going to hire somebody who contributes more than they cost. And that's why I hire them and make them an employee. So the employer is looking for that. The other thing that an employer will tell you that they want most in an employee, and you'll hear it over and over again, and you'll hear it later on when I talk about talking to employers, is employers will tell us they want somebody who wants to be here. The most important attribute for an employer is somebody who wants to be there. You can have the most talented person in the world, and you put them in a job and they don't want to be there. It's no good to the employer. You have a person who needs lots of supports, but they're really excited about being there. That's a value. So the reality is that an employer wants somebody who contributes more than they cost. And cost is not always production or money. It can be a lot of things. And then the third one is our funding source. Now, when I say, what does our funding source want from the process, right about now, a lot of people go, miracles. Well, I don't really think they want miracles. It just seems like that. The reality is what they really want is for us to make customer one and customer two happy for the most reasonable and least amount of resources expended. So they don't want to spend excess resources to try to make customer one and customer two happy. So we have to be efficient. You know, there isn't an unlimited amount of resources in our field, and there certainly isn't an unlimited amount of resources in our organizations or agencies. So we have to understand that efficiency is a component of it. So as I talk about what our three customers want, one of the really interesting things is that those things aren't quite in harmony just by themselves. But there's one place where all three of our customers' needs come together. Anybody got any idea where that is? Anybody got any idea where that is?
Job match.
Job match. What a great answer. In fact, job match is always the right answer. Job match is the most important thing in the community-based employment process. It's the only thing that all three of our customers want from us, a quality job match. In fact, the definition of a quality job match is it meets the needs of all three of our customers. And so the reality is the job match is everything. Everything we do in employment services should lead up to the job match, and everything that we do should support the job match. The job match is everything. The most important thing we can think about is that if we're doing other things, it doesn't always make them wrong, but they're probably not as efficient as we think we are, because everything in employment services should be focused on the job match. It's the only thing that all three of our customers want from us, and it's the only place where we can realistically define success. Now, a job match where the customer's needs aren't in balance is kind of like a three-legged stool with one leg too long or one leg too short. You can hold it up with lots of effort, but eventually it's going to fall over. And when it falls over, all three of our customers get burned. So we've got to be really thoughtful about staying focused on the job match and talking about job match. It's critical that every time we talk to our customers, we talk about the job match. We talk to people, we say, hey, my job is helping you find yourself a job. We talk to the employer, my job is to help you find a good employee for yourself. We talk to the funding agent and we say, look, it's really important that we find a good job match for the person and a good site. Job match is the conversation we want to have, and job match is what we want to be focused on. Now, a lot of people, when we start talking about job match, they want the pill. You want that quick little pill that they can take. How do I get there so quickly? Well, I would say this. I mean, if I had the pill, I used to say I would be someplace exotic, but now that I'm here in Hawaii, I'm just going to say that you know, I wouldn't be any place more exotic, but I would certainly be someplace where people were feeding me grapes or something if I had the pill and be billing pretty highly. So there really isn't a pill, but there is a secret to success. And I'm going to share that with you. There is a secret to success. The problem is you're going to believe and understand that this is the secret and this is the secret to success. But unfortunately, I believe you already know it. And how I can show you know it is finish this adage. In business, it's not always what you know, it's who you know. Exactly. And that relationship is the success that we're looking for. You're going to have the most amount of success by having sustained relationships with employers. We can provide services to people with disabilities. We've been doing that for a couple of 100 years, but we're not going to have success in employment services without employers. Employers have to become our partners. And within a geographic catchment area, there's only a limited number of employers. And if we do things that burn them up, we're really quickly out of the employment business. So we have to make sure that we're sustaining and maintaining employers, especially in rural areas. Where I grew up, where I'm from in New England, very rural, parts of where we are here in Hawaii, there's parts of the other states, very rural. And we want to make sure that we understand that there's a limited number of employers in that area. We've got to build those relationships. But even in urban areas, in a catchment area, there's a limited number of employers. We can't be burning them up. So relationships are everything. We're going to talk about how to build those and sustain those today. Now, a lot of times when I start talking about relationships, and I start talking about our the people in our field going out and talking to employers, they get a little nervous. And that's because people sometimes don't have a lot of experience, but they're also, in my opinion, most scared of what I call the 10-yard mile. If you don't know what the 10-yard mile is, it's if you walk 10 yards across the dance floor to ask somebody to dance and they go, no, it's a mile back to your seat. Okay, that rejection factor. The rejection factor is everything to staff. But the reality is, if we're getting a lot of rejection from employers, we're probably saying the wrong things, because employers need employees and want employees. So if we're not saying the correct things to employers, we're probably getting a high level of rejection. The other thing that employers tell us over and over, and I've been in the field a long time, been in the field probably over 35 years, maybe closer to 40 now. And the reality is, I've heard it at employer forums. I've talked to employers. I've been an employer after hours. I've been an employer many times. Employers will tell us over and over and over, we don't want programs. But for some reason in our field, because we're funded by programs and we think about programs when we're on that side of the bridge, we want to talk about programs and we want to sell programs. And the really bad news is when we do that, some really negative things can happen. I was doing some work with an organization up in the Northeast, and they had worked with a company that had a few different locations, and they had made a couple of placements at 4 or 5 of those locations. And they invited me up because they were wanting to do some work about interventions. And I was sitting in the office of the manager when she got a call from the employer, and the employer said, I'm really unhappy with how that went down. I want you to take everybody out of all my sites. And the lady was devastated, and she hung up, and she said, I said, what happened? Because I couldn't quite hear the conversation. I could hear the employer yelling. And she said, well, we had a problem at one of our sites with the employee, but more importantly, with the employment facilitator. And the employer said that we had to take everybody out of all their sites. And I said, so what does that tell you? You know, and that's really bad. And I'm sorry for you. And that's sad. And that's sad for the people who work there. But what does it tell you? And she goes, I don't know. And I go, that we probably sold ourselves as a program. And the person didn't get fired, the program did. And that's one of the downsides of selling a program, is that the person doesn't get fired, the program does. And in reality, in the world of chaos and employment, employers are going to have multiple employees. And potentially, if we provide services to a number of people, they might have different employees from our organization. So a lot of people get stuck with being a great advocate for the first employee, to the point where they don't realize that they also need to be a good advocate for all the other potential people that would work there. So the key is to maintain the relationship with the employer. We certainly want to advocate and be supportive of the people that we work with, but we don't want to do it in such a way that we alienate the employer, because we need the employer for potential other jobs or other relationships. And when you start burning employers, not only do you burn that employer, you burn all the employers in their contact, their network. So the reality is we got to be very thoughtful about that. And it's always stunning to me how much people want to sell programs. And one of the key elements of selling a program is when we distribute a brochure, because a brochure is 100% about a program. I mean, you know, we can mask it and say anything we want about it, but a brochure is talking about a program. And I see things like, and we'll help you with the ADA. You know, the ADA is, let me show you my big silver pistol. I won't shoot you with it, but look at it. Isn't it shiny? And look at a hole it puts in the wall, but I won't shoot you with it because we're experts in the ADA and we'll help you with that. That's a veiled threat. You know, we don't think of that, and we don't think we're saying that. But see, it's not what we think we say to the employer that matters. It's what the employer hears. You know, that's just like as a supervisor. It's not what we think we're saying. It's what the person we're supporting or that we're supervising hears, or even a colleague or someone we're training. It's not what we're saying that matters. It's what they're hearing that matters. And so we have to be very thoughtful about that. So yes, I understand people leaning towards selling programs, and you hear things about national programs for diversity. And I think those are wonderful initiatives, but job matches happen at the direct level. They happen at the supervisor level. And that's where we need to have relationships and understand job matching, because I've seen a lot of national efforts lose steam when it gets to the direct service level. So we want to make sure that we're not falling into these traps. So when I use the term job matching to me means any of these opportunities or some combination of them. It means that we're looking for full-time employment, part-time employment, temporary opportunities, situational assessment opportunities, job trial, internship, or apprenticeships. I'm always looking for all of those. And I may go there because I'm looking for an opportunity for someone. But when I walk through the door of the employer, and you'll hear me say this again later, the employer has to be my customer, because the employer is going to have all these opportunities. And if I'm so highly focused, intentionally focused on just one of these, I might miss all of the other opportunities. True job carving and creation come about through creatively understanding the employer's needs. And we don't understand the employer's needs if we're too highly focused on just one effort or one event. So that's, again, another flaw to being focused on just one person. I often hear a lot of people say to me, so Rick, so you're saying we should do generic job development or individualized job development? And I go, yes, because you got to be doing both all the time. They are not in conflict. They are, in fact, part of the same thing. They are one and the same. We can individually job develop because we believe in individualized job matches, and we can be generically job developing because we're looking for all kinds of opportunities. They are not separate. They are not in conflict. They're, in fact, synonymous. We can do both. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the flow of employment. The flow of employment, this is a good diagram for it. In my opinion, the flow of employment really lends itself well to this because it helps us understand a couple of things. So if we start at the top and a person comes in at the referral level. Now, a referral can be from an external source, or it can be, if we're a larger organization and we have other departments, it can be from one of the other departments. And it comes in and it's a referral to the service system. Then from that point, we want to do a high quality assessment of needs, wants, desires, skills, and abilities. What it really means is we want to use the time to discover the person, know them, get to know the person, get to know their jazz. Remember I talked about that recipe earlier? We've got to learn what that person's recipe is for their job success at this point in time. It doesn't mean that's going to be for them forever, because we talked about the management of chaos. People are going to grow and change. But for a given point in time, we've got to understand what their jazz is, and we're going to help them find a situation that meets that. And so then we develop the P. We do some Ping and we put it into a plan, and we're good there. And that facilitates the person into the job match. So in order to do a job match, we need to know about the person. Correspondingly, we need to know the employer. And the bottom arrows here, bottom arrow, is the relationship with the employer. It starts with initial contact, where we say something to the employer. And we really want all of our staff to almost be saying the same thing here, so there's a consistency of message. Because at the initial discussion with the employer, one of two things happen. We either build upon what we say, or we spend the rest of the time trying to recover from what we said. And it's much more effective to build upon it and move it along. So the initial contact is a key component. And we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about managing that initial contact, because that is so critical. And then the next step is relationship building. Some people use the term informational interviewing or stuff like that. I love the terms. They're fine. They're synonymous. But we got to build the relationship with the employer. After we have a relationship with the employer, that means we know the employer, we know their jobs. Now we're ready to see if there's a job match, facilitate the job match. And that's when we make the proposal. And a proposal should sound something like this. I've looked at your job. I have somebody who's really jazzed about doing it. And here's the supports they're going to need. Is this something you'd be interested in doing? That point, the employer could give me a no. But up until that, if I get a no from the employer, there's a high probability that I've been saying the wrong thing. And we'll talk about that process more. So the initial contact, relationship building, the proposal, and then service after the match. That's what we talk about when we talk about supporting the employer. Now, one of the key elements of this conversation is, from the initial contact, we have to think about, as an organization, where we're really going to position our energy. Now, I'm gonna say this is the employee and this is the employer. Now, we want to be everywhere to support both of them, but the majority of our energy can be here, here, or here. And a lot of times people tell me they want it to be here. And that's really a big mistake, because what happens is the employee starts treating me like it's my job, and the employer starts treating me like it's my employee, which is exactly the opposite of what we want to develop. So we need to be supporting the employer to support their employee. The more effective the employer is at supporting their employee, the better it is for everybody. So we want to give resources and help to the employer to support their employee, because again, the whole purpose of the employee being there is to be integrated into the site, be a contributing member of the workforce, and not be our people. And that's a term that I really struggle with when I hear a lot, is I hear people say, well, our people, or they generalize. Now, if employers were to stigmatize folks that we work with and generalize them, we'd be furious about it. But unfortunately, sometimes in our field, we do it with the employer unintentionally. We talk about our field, we talk about what the type of people we serve, and we generalize them. That's so harsh, because every person, no matter what their service eligible disability is, each person manifests it differently, and each person has a different recipe. So if we're really talking about individualized support and individualized pieces, we want to stay away from those generalizations. And we see it over and over and over again. So we'll talk more about that as we talk a little bit further. And then the last part is how effective we are at providing service after the match affects our network. Now, service after the match doesn't have to mean that all the jobs work out. You know, in an ideal employer, when they hire people off the street, they are happy if they get 70% success rate in keeping people for a duration of time. You know, that's the Hall of Fame for an employer. 70% and a 30% turnover, that's Hall of Fame. In our field, unfortunately, we're in the under 20%, 14 to 20% success rate. And so the reality is that I'm not talking about going from what we're doing now to 100%. I'm talking about going now to 70%. But, you know, that's over a 50% increase. That would be fantastic. So good processes are going to help, but we can't have the fantasy that everybody's going to be 100% successful. And we can't have the fantasy that employers aren't going to lose people, because employers don't have that fantasy. They understand that 7 out of 10 is the Hall of Fame. And if we can get close to that, they'll be happy with our services. And people are going to leave jobs. And we have to be able to support both the person and the employer when people leave jobs, either because they want to leave or because they need to leave. But whatever the reason, we need to be able to support both folks through that process. So let's talk about some tools to help us do that. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time today talking about quality assessment, because I think that's something that people learn a lot about in discovery. I want to spend today talking about the initial contact and the relationship building to start, because I think that's really where we can get some impact in employment services. So let's talk a little bit about the initial contact. In doing that, we have to understand a little bit about getting to that first contact. There's a number of ways in which we're going to come upon the initial contact with the employer. There are 4 doors into an employer. I'm going to treat it as 4 doors. We're going to talk about the 4 doors in. Now, if you were to walk up to a building and there were 4 doors going into a building and one of them was locked, what would you normally do? You'd go around to one of the other doors, right? For some reason in our field, if somebody go to one of the doors and it's locked, they sit on the stoop and cry about how they didn't get in. So we've got to remember that we want to use all 4 doors. So let's talk about the 4 doors. Now I'm going to talk about them, but I want to be clear that I'm just initially right now just describing what the 4 doors are. The reality is that not all of the doors are unlocked at the same rate. And so we want to make sure that we understand which doors are going to lead to a probably better outcome for us. So let's talk, they could all lead to the right outcome, but which one's got a higher probability? Let's talk about that. So the first door is job seeker formal. Now, job seeker formal are things like applications, resumes, online applications, career fairs. So these are very formal ways for the job seeker to be connected with an employer. That's one door. Everybody understand what that door is? Good. The other door is team member formal. This is traditionally what people call cold calling. So this could be cold calling or business to business networking, or it might even be a business after hours if we're not managing our relationship with employers in a productive way. But those are all what we would call formal team member. So everybody understands that door. The next door is called job seeker informal. And informal are things like family, neighbors, relationships, places that people work, places, organizations they belong to, people they know. And I was doing this training in the Midwest a few years ago, and this lady stood up and she goes, "Wait right there." That's how they talk in the Midwest. And I said, "What?" And she goes, "You don't understand. I'm going to keep my personal life and my professional life separate, and never the two shall meet." And before I could say another word, another person in the training stood up and said, "Wait a minute, you wouldn't give your friends, family, neighbors, people you know in business a good job match?" And that said it all, didn't it? If you're job matching, you're doing people a favor. If you're not job matching, you should be scared to talk to employers. So if you're not job matching, we should be very frightened to talk to employers. But if we're job matching, we're doing a favor for everyone. So that kind of makes the point about the last one, which is team member informal. Friends, family, neighbors, people we have relationships with. But the really interesting thing is, one of the things I told you, the key to success is not what you know, it's the more I can move through whatever door I went through, the employers into this door, I want to do that. So let's talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. But of the 4 doors, which one do you think has the greatest probability of someone getting an interview through? And for those who said informal team members, that's exactly right. What's the number 2 one? Although we don't do it well in our field and we need to get better at it, that would be the job seeker informal. And the third return is on team member formal. Now, that doesn't mean that's a bad thing, but it's the third least likely to get somebody. So that tells us about allocating staff resources. We wouldn't want to not do it, but it's probably not the place to put the majority of our resources. And then the least effective, by quite a bit actually, is job seeker formal. The return on applications and resumes is minuscule. I was doing some work with an organization and I sat at the desk in their HR department. And I sat right at the desk and was waiting for a meeting. And I wasn't there for employment services. I was there doing some coaching for managers. But I sat outside in HR because I was going to have a contract meeting. And right across from me was a lady that had a HR manager title on her desk. And I said to her, I said, "Wow." And she had a pile like this in front of her. I said, "Wow, you look like you're kind of busy." She goes, "Yeah." And I would say there was 300 pieces of paper there, maybe more. And I said, "What are those?" And she goes, "Those are applications and resumes." I go, "Wow, that's a lot." She goes, "Well, yeah, but there were 3,000 that applied for the job." And I go, "So you took 3,000? She goes, "I didn't, the software did." So when you put applications and resumes in, software screens for them. So I wasn't paying much attention because I was getting ready for my meeting and I'm on my cell phone. And I look over after about 10 minutes, she actually took a call and said, "Lunch? Yeah, that sounds good. 10 minutes? Yeah." And when I looked over just before she got up to go to lunch, she had got it down to 3 or 4 applications. So I said to her, I said, "Wow, you went through those really quick." And she goes, "Well, I knew what I was looking for." And I said, "Wow, that's really interesting." And she goes, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, what happens with the referral?" She says, "We'll bring them in for an interview or have an initial interview with them. And if that doesn't work out, I'll grab a couple more from the pile." But think about it, 3,000 people went to 3 without a human being seeing them, and then some person spending less than 10 minutes going through them. And people say, "Well, is that unusual?" Well, my wife works in human resources, and I asked her that, and she said, "Oh, that's very common for most organizations." She worked in healthcare, and she said for the healthcare organizations, very, very common. Happens all the time. In fact, she said most employers either do it online or, even small mom and pops use software to screen people. So that caught my attention. And then another thing caught my attention was I was doing some work through the NEON program, and I was working with a provider agency, and they were saying that they were having trouble getting placements. So I went in to work with them, and they had 2 job developers. They were large enough organizations, so they had 2 full-time job developers. So I went in for the first day and I sat down with the job developers and I said, "So what'd you guys do last 2 weeks?" And both of the job developers said, "Well, for the last 2 weeks, we spent the whole 40 hours working with these two people. And we went out and we filled out 200 applications and resumes. I was like, you spent 40 hours each. So that was 80 hours per week for 2 weeks. So 160 hours of time filling out resumes and applications. They go, oh yeah. They were all excited about it. I said, okay. And I said, that was also mostly billable, right? Yep, that's why we did it. And I said, okay. So I didn't say much more. We did this work that I'm doing with you today. And they went out and they started having a little more success talking to employers and getting through things. But I didn't say much more. And then about 2 months later, I had a follow-up Zoom with them. And I sit down with them and I said, so tell me, how you remember that when I first started, you went out and you did those, all those applications, resumes, couple hundred of them for each person. And then went, yeah. And I go, well, how many of those did you get a return on? And the answer was 0. And I said, so you spent 160 hours of time and got 0 return. And I said, well, that tells us something about that door. That might not be as productive approach as we really want. So we got to think about that when we talk about allocating our time. And when I say that, that tells me a lot about our staff. If I look and go about my job developers and the picture to the left is an office full of people. If that's the morning or the evening, I'm okay with it. But if the middle of the day, that's what my job developers are doing, I'm not very happy about it. I want my job developers being on the right-hand side because jobs are in the community. Relationships are in the community. They're not in the office. So we really want to make sure that employer developers are out building a relationship. Now, right about now, I've heard it here and I'll hear it when I talk a little bit more about assessing jobs. I hear people say to me, Rick, we just don't have time to do that. And let's think about that for a minute. So if you don't have time to make a good job match, what do you have time to do? Because if you make a bad job match, do you know how many hours that's going to consume trying to fix it? So I don't even understand that concept of we don't have enough hours. I mean, we may not have enough hours for the people we serve, and I get that because we always have more need in our field than we have resources, but not enough hours to do it right doesn't make sense to me, because if you have enough hours to do it wrong, which costs you more effort and energy and failure, why would we not want to do it as well as we can? So let's talk about the stages of employment development. As you saw on the arrow at the bottom of the flow of employment services, there's the initial contact. Some people call it an informational interview, but I like the term relationship building, proposal, and service after the match. Let's spend some time talking about the initial contact. Now, I like to use an analogy when I talk about the initial contact of dating. Now, I am not an expert in dating for obvious reasons, but the reality is that we can use the concepts of dating to talk a little bit about job development. Now, in dating, is it a good idea during the first date to tell the person everything about yourself? No. In fact, if you do, you rarely have date number 2. Okay. Is it also a good idea in dating to propose marriage during the first date? No, it's probably not a good idea. Even if you don't say, well, we're going to get married, you even just talk about, well, I know we're maybe not going to get married, but if we did, here's what it would be like. It would be out on the beach at sunset. There would be this type of music playing. We'd be doing all this. That's still not a great thing to do on the first date. Another thing to do when you're dating is to not sit at home, take a phone book and call people up and go, hey, you want to go out? Hey, you want to go out? Hey, you want to go out? Because if somebody said yes, you should actually be a little bit concerned about that. So the reality is that that's kind of the things that we see sometimes in employment services for contacting employers. And the other thing is after the first date, you have that first date, it goes well. Do you give the person a brochure about yourself? That's kind of weird, isn't it? It doesn't facilitate building a relationship. It's kind of awkward and weird. So the reality is that we've got to start thinking about practicality in talking to employers. Now, we do know some things. Now, I don't want to scare people away and have them say that this is all about sales, but relationship sales is really important. And if anybody's been in a high-end training around relationship sales, you know that a very small percentage, probably around 1 or 2% of high-end relationship sales are made during the first contact. If you jump to the second contact, it only goes up a few more percentile. If you jump to the third contact, it only goes up a few more percentile. It's after the fourth contact that 95% of all high-end sales are made. So what does that tell us about high-end relationship sales? It's about building the relationship before we make the proposal. So that's why dating is a good analogy, is because we don't want to be proposing marriage on that first contact. And frequently I will hear employment staff propose, you got any job openings? We're here to get out one of our people a job. Wow, right away. You know, and I know it's way too early because I haven't even seen a job. I don't even know if I would want to support somebody to work here. So, you know, that proposing marriage, and that's why they get that 10-yard mile. They get the rejection too quickly because they're proposing marriage too quickly and they're not going to get more dates. So we want to think about that. So during the initial contact with the employer, we really want to make sure that we are thinking about the steps. Now, when somebody knocks on your door, what are the two questions that jump right into your mind? Who are you and what do you want? Jumps right out, right? Every time somebody knocks on your door, obvious things. So we have to be able to articulate that in very short order. And then we have to realize that all employers listen to one radio station. And it's an FM station. You can see it here. It's WIIFM. And for you guys that aren't familiar with that radio station, it is what is in it for me. And all employers listen to that radio station. And if you don't broadcast on that radio station, they turn the channel on you. They sit there and they're listening to another tune, because the reality is the lights are on, but nobody's home when you're not broadcasting on WIIFM. So when we have that initial contact, no matter where we are, we have to be thinking about who are we and what do we want and what do we do? Now, if any of you have ever been in a bar, some really interesting thing happens, because your job opening a coffee bar, for some of you don't. But if you've ever been in a bar, you ever been in a bar? Yeah, okay, I didn't mean this morning. And the reality is that you go to a bar and you sit down. And unless they're saying something corny like, what's your sign or something, what are the two questions people usually ask you? Who are you and what do you do? And when we go, oh, you know, well, I help people with disabilities get jobs. And you see that face, like, oh, that's magnificent. You must be special. You must be so patient. You're doing goodness's work. You really are. And everybody goes, well, I hate it when they say that. But we elicited that. Why did we feel the need to say that? Why didn't we just say we help people get jobs? You know, that whole piece seemed to be really a bizarre message. Now, it's not that I'm pretending that we should ever hide the fact that we're working with people who need disabilities, but that's a really interesting term, because isn't a disability defined by the environment? So, you know, I've had people that were service eligible who would get jobs that needed no supports from the service system. To the employer, they had no barriers to employment. They might be service eligible, but they had no barriers to employment. And the other side of it is I look around here and I don't see anybody here who has a 90-mile-an-hour fastball. And I don't see anybody who has a great curveball. So if a major league team was looking for a pitcher, I could go, well, I have some of these pitchers. And then I have these profoundly disabled people. And you'd all go, well, why would you talk about us? We're not candidates. Exactly. Why would I talk about you if you're not candidates? And you are profoundly disabled as a major league pitcher. You don't have that capacity. Bad news, not a job match. And the reality is we've got to understand that when we're talking to the employer, that's the message we want to convey. We want to convey that we have somebody for their job, or we say to them, you know, I looked at your job and I don't have anybody who can meet your needs right now. That's the most important thing you can say to an employer, because now they know you're not jamming. You know, you're not proposing marriage. You're not forcing marriage in the relationship. So who are you and what do you want? So we walk in the door to an employer, and no matter how we meet them, whether we meet them through any of the four doors, you know, or we have a warm contact, or we walk in straight up, we talk to the gatekeeper and get through the gatekeeper. We want to have all of our employment staff and all of our management staff talking about our employment services the same way. Now, many agencies have multiple services, you know, and that's fine, but we're talking about employment services. So when we're talking about employment services, we want to be able to talk about that. So when we walk into an employer, we never want to walk into the employer and go, so what do you do here? Because that sounds really ridiculous. Or can I have a tour? Yeah, get behind the third grade group when they go through on Friday afternoons. The reality is we have to go into the employer and try to understand what they need, but we've got to do it in a way that makes sense to them. So when I walk into an employer, I want to say who I am and what I do. So I'm going to walk into an employer and I'm going to say, my name is Rick McAllister, and I work for, and I'll say the name of the organization I work for, but I'm also going to say I'm with their employment and training services department or their employment and training department, because employment and training means something to an employer. And I'm with the employment and training department. So if I'm with a large ARC, or I'm with an Easter Seals, or I'm a Goodwill, or some other type of organization that's well known and has multiple services, I'm going to say I'm with that organization and I'm with their employment and training department, because that's what I'm here for. I'm here about employment and training. So my name is Rick McAllister and I'm with this organization and I'm with their employment and training department. Now that's who I am. Now, before I just leave that hanging with the employer, I'm also going to say what I want. And a really nice thing to say to the employer, something that makes sense to them without proposing marriage, is I'm going to say something like this to them. I'm Rick McAllister. I'm with this organization. We're an employment training service here in the area. It's very important that I understand your employment and training needs so I can better prepare the people I'm working with to be good candidates in the market. Because every employer wants good candidates in the market. But notice what I'm not proposing: marriage. I'm not saying a good candidate for you. I'm not saying somebody who can do your job. I'm saying good candidates in the market. And so that really allows the employer to have the WIIFM. Now, does that sell them on everything? No, but see how that sends a message of that it's the starting of me saying job match. Now, if the employer says to me, are you an employment agency? I'm going to say, yeah, because I am. I'm not going to say, well, sort of, but kind of, yeah, my department's doing employment training. Yeah. Or employment services. Yeah. How much do you charge? Well, we're at no cost to the employer because we're paid through candidate fees or client fees or customer fees, whatever term you like. But that's how you're all paid. We're all paid through fees to support the people we're providing. We don't want to get into it. Well, these are your federal dollars at work. These are your state agency dollars at work. One of the big lies is I'm from the government. I'm here to help. The second big lie is I'm glad you're here. So the reality is we want to stay away from those lies. And the reality is we just say it and see people say, well, Zeppelin, no, that's how I'm paid. The employer just wants to know that we're not charging them. And, we say at no cost to the employer. Well, you get that call every night at 6 o'clock where people go, at no cost to you for 90 days, and so the employer is just asking, so how does it work? I'm going to say we're paid through candidate fees, customer fees, client fees, whatever term you like, but that's how we're paid. I'm going to say that. And then the employer might say to me, oh, I know your organization. You work with people with disabilities, don't you? And here's what I say. Oh, yeah. Notice how I don't say more right there. I don't go, and we have the high functioning, low functioning, the able, disabled. We have the good people, the bad people, the awful people, the middle people, the whole array. Why do we need to? Yes, I work with people with disabilities. Sure. Yeah. And if the employer says, what type of disabilities? Well, here's people say to me, Rick, there's a really good opportunity to teach him about or her about disabilities. I can't in 20 minutes teach people about disabilities. I can't do it. I can't do it in 20 hours. I can't do it in 20 semesters, in my opinion. So the reality is I know that's a falsehood. And besides, I don't want to teach you about a disability type because everybody manifests it differently. So here's what I usually say. They say, do you work with people with disabilities? Oh, yeah. What kind? Well, that really depends on the person and the job. We really haven't talked about anybody yet, or I don't even know what job we're talking about, but when I knew a job and a person, then we evaluate the barriers that person might have to employment, and that's what we talk about. But I said, I really don't know who I'd talk about right now. And people say, that sounds like you're being evasive. No, because I don't know. That is absolutely straightforward, the honest answer. I haven't seen a job, so I don't know what job to talk about. And I might have gone to that employer because I was going there looking for a job for Patrick, and that's who's paying me. But remember, I said, when I walk in the door of the employer, who's my customer? The employer. So until I know that there's a job there for Patrick, I'm not going to talk about anybody. So that telling the employer that statement isn't blowing smoke, but it's a nice way of saying two things. One is that barriers to employment or disabilities are individualized and specific to an environment, but it also is a nice way of saying that we do job match, because I don't know the job and I don't know the person. And whenever we want to think about communicating to employers or to funding sources or to people, we want to be saying job match. Now, remember I said at the beginning, when we talk to a person, we want to say, my job is to help you get yourself a job. And we talk to the employer, my job is to help you get yourself an employee. I want to stay consistent with that message to the employer. So do you work with people with disabilities? Yes. What kind? Well, that really depends on the job and the person. We haven't really talked about a person or a job yet, but if person were to work at a company, I would always make sure that the barriers to employment were known and the supports were figured out. And then the employer could say to me, well, you know, I can't see a person with a disability working here. Well, that kind of turns me off, but I always say this, I can't either if they couldn't do the job. And that's the end of it. And so I know that, but I don't get that. You know, people believe an employer is going to say that, but I've been doing this for, as I said, almost 40 years. I've been in 40 years. I've heard 2 employers say something like that. You know, and that doesn't imply that I've only talked to 10 employers in my life. I'm telling you that I've talked to a lot of them. And so the reality is that that's much more of a fantasy from us than it is a reality. So what do you look for in equality? So then they say to me, okay, what can I do for you? And I say to them, what do you look for in a quality candidate? Because remember the first thing I said was, I'm here to find out your employment and training needs. So I'm going to ask them very directly, what do you look for in a quality candidate? Now, I'm going to write it down in the employer file. And if you miss, I'm going to talk about an employer file. We should have a file on every employer that we have a relationship with. And now we've talked to an employer, we have a relationship. So I'm going to write it down, but I'm going to ask them the question, what do you look for in a quality candidate? And I'm going to write down whatever they say, and I'm going to write verbatim the way they say it. But I've heard it so many times. Do you know what an employer is going to say to me? I want somebody who wants to be here. That's what they look for in a quality candidate, somebody who wants to be here. You know, they don't ever say can do the job, because again, why would they hire somebody who can't do the job with their own supports? So they're going to say, I want somebody who can do the job. And excuse me, not do the job. That's what human services is. They're going to say, I want somebody who wants to be here. And then I asked them what I call the $1 million question. So where are you getting those folks from right now? Where do you get those folks from? And that starts telling me some very interesting things about the employer. It tells me about their culture, and it tells me about where they're coming at in the employment process. So if the employer says something like this to me, well, you know, we get most of our job referrals through internal referrals. Perfect. In my head, I'm going, oh, that's perfect. That's job matching. They buy into it. We're going to be able to work well together. I don't say that right away, because then I sound like Jolly John, the car salesman. Have I got a deal for you? But in my head, I'm clicking that off. If they say to me, well, you know, we put ads in the newspaper and online and Indeed, and, you know, we post them, and I'm thinking, okay, they like to chum for their staff, then good. You know, they do a little chumming and they see who comes up. I want to go get my staff, but fine. So I say that, but I say in my head, I can do better than that. You know, so in my head, but I don't say it because Jolly John, the car salesman, you know, because I may not even want to work with this employer. I still don't know their culture or their jobs well enough yet. So then the third thing they might say is they say, well, you know, we get all of our job placements from the vocational technical college office of placement. Where's my next visit going to be? I'm going to build a relationship with them because they got it going on. You know what I'm saying? So that's who I'm going to start networking with. And then some employers will say a combination of any, and that's kind of more of the reality for most employers. But see how it starts telling me a little bit about their culture? So then after that, I say to them, I said, okay, when you hire a new employee, how do you do training here? And that starts telling me even more about their culture. Because if they say, well, we have a training program and we have people certified in training, we train them well, and we have trainers, then I'm thinking if I find a match for somebody here, probably the training piece is going to be something that I can support the employer and they're already doing well. If they say we have coworkers train it, okay, in my head, I'm going, okay, probably going to have to, if we need to do some training or support, I'm going to have to take a more active role, or organizations have to take a more active role in that here. So see how that starts telling us the culture. How do you do training? And then after that, we asked for 15 minutes with the employer, or we should be looking for 15 minutes with the employer. And we say, job descriptions are not all they're cracked up to be. But I have this tool called the job skills inventory, and it lets me understand the job. I use it to make sure that I understand the components of a job, the critical components of a job. And it takes me about a half an hour to look at a job and understand it. I know you're really busy, so if you could set me up with a lead person in a department or something, I'll be in and out really quickly. I'll schedule a time, I'll come look at the job. I'll be in and out in a half an hour, and I'll send you a copy of the job skills inventory after I complete it. And I've got to tell you, again, I've been doing this a long time, and I had very few employers who tell me, no, they don't want to see the job. In fact, some employers, when I say that to them, they say, well, of course, how could you know the job if you've never seen it? And in our field, we're all surprised by that. I hear people all the time this is one of my pet peeves. I hear people all the time tell me, I know a job. And I'm like, okay, so let's talk about, I'm not a fan of these type of jobs, but cleaning the bathrooms at a Burger King. You know how to do that? Yeah. Okay. So who's going to clean the vent fan? Well, I said, well, some have shift staff doing it. Some don't want shift staff climbing ladders, so they have the manager, the assistant manager doing it. And some don't want them doing it, so they have the facilities person doing it. Doesn't it matter who's going to climb the ladder to who you match for it? And wouldn't it be bad if you made the match and then you found out that it was something the person could or couldn't do? I said, so don't get caught in the trap of thinking we know jobs. And the other part about a job is it's not the same job from one shift to another. It's very different. And the other bad news is if a supervisor comes into a job and they leave and a new supervisor comes in, the job just changed. That's that chaos thing. So we've got to understand that as we're going through the process. So that's the initial contact. Now we could have got there by dropping in to set up an interview, and we'll get the gatekeeper. And people say, well, what do I say to the gatekeeper? Hi, my name is Rick McAllister. I work for such and such an organization, and we're an employment training service here in the area. And it's really important that I understand your employment training so I can better prepare people to be good candidates in the job market. Who should I talk to? See, that's the message we want to be sending about them. If I go to business after hours, what do I say about our program? Well, first of all, you don't say the word program, and you say, hi, I'm Rick McAllister. I'm with the such and such an agency. I'm with their employment training services. That's what I say. That's what I am, and that's what I do. And when we're not doing that, it becomes all these bizarre other things. So next, we're going to talk about, I've talked about the job skills inventory, but I want to quickly talk about the employer file before we talk about the job skills inventory. So you remember I said you want to have an employer file. We want to document all the contacts with our employer. So we would have in the employer file the demographics of where the company is, any background information that we did, because remember I said we don't walk into a company and go, so what do you do here? So we would have done some research to know some things about the company. We're going to put that in the employer file. We're going to put the contact. So if I got the contact by dropping in and talking to the gatekeeper, or I made a contact with the manager about, what type of job it is, or I had a friend of mine get me set up with that person, that's called a warm contact. I do that, I would write that's how I get in and who I talk to. And then I'm going to have something called a relationship management plan. And that's a fancy term for what do I do next? What's my next relationship? Because I want to keep working on building the relationship. So I went in and I looked at a job skills inventory. They didn't have any openings, and it was okay because I didn't have anybody for it, but I did the job skills inventory. I know the job. Well, in a few days, I'm going to call the manager back up after I've sent him the job skills inventory and said, I didn't have anybody for that job, but I'd like to look at another job. Do you think that would be something we could do? And the more of those you do, the more you get to know people there. But once you've done one and they see that it's painless and you send them a copy and you don't try to jam somebody in if they don't have an opening, then you can start looking at some other jobs. And when you start looking at other jobs, that's when we find things like job carving, job creation, job opportunities, part-time, full-time, situational assessment opportunities. One of the best situational assessment opportunities that I ever had in my career was we were doing some work with a small loading department, and they actually loaded trains and unloaded trains. And, we were actually looking to see if there was anybody that would drive a forklift and stuff, but, we didn't really have anybody that wanted that, and it wasn't quite well run. But in one of their side rooms on Thursdays, they had some shipments come in that went to the local places, and they had to break them down. But they only needed a person on Thursdays to come in and break down the boxes and sort them for delivery. What an incredible situational assessment site where that is. I think that the agency that I was working with still has that, 25, 30 years later, they still have that as one of their situational assessment sites. And the employer loves it because they pay a flat rate of, minimum wage for a flat set of hours. People come in, the employment facilitator's there, helps facilitate, uses it to training. The employer gets it done for a flat rate. And it's a perfect situational assessment, right? So see if people like it, they don't like it, what they can do, what they can't do. It's perfect. So but we didn't see that until we looked at our second job at that employer. We didn't even know that existed. So going in and looking at jobs is critical. So then we also want to start thinking about those cultural assessments. Now, I told you that we start learning about the culture. Now, there are some formal cultural assessments. A guy named Dr. David Hagner actually developed a really nice one. And you can Google it and download it, or get your copy of it. I got a copy somewhere. But I don't love the formal cultural assessments, but I've used them. They're good to read over and sort of understand. But I really want to know the basics of culture. I want to know, like, when somebody has a birthday, how do we do it? When somebody's late, or if there's a problem, how do we manage it? That's the cultural stuff I want to know. Those soft interactions, therefore soft skills. And then, of course, the job skills inventory, which I'm going to talk about in a second, which is, I think, one of the more powerful tools that we want staff to have available to them. And then flow charts, which is the flow of the order of activities that's going to happen. Flow charts are very important because as we watch a job, the sequence of it can be very important, especially if we start looking at opportunities for job carving and job creation. We want to be able to look at flow and see where we could insert and where we could potentially contribute to the employer in a way that makes sense for them. So let's talk about the job skills inventory. So the job skills inventory is a tool that helps us understand the job. Now, when we first look at the job skills inventory, I get that the scientific evaluation of it. Oh my gosh, it's 11 pages and there's 56 questions. Yeah, there are, but that's because most of the work has been done for us. Now, if you'll notice, there are 4 options, 4 or 5 in some cases, 4 or 5 options under each item. Those are not the only choices. Those are just 4 points on a continuum so that people can pick one of the choices, but then we have to write a comment. Now, the purpose of the comment is to make sure that someone else would understand what the expectation of the job is. So when we write it, we don't want to write it so it's a cue for us to remember. We want to write it so someone else could read it and understand what it means. Because this document, once it's completed, is going to go in the employer file. And over time, we have a whole bunch of perspectives of jobs. See, and when we were talking about job development earlier, one of the reasons that we need to understand and build relationship with employers is because when we have a referral come into us and they're looking for employment, we don't want it to be like if we owned a store and somebody comes in and goes, I need a bushel of apples. And we grab a handful of seeds and run out back and throw them in the dirt. We should be having at least some employers and some reference points where we could start connecting and looking for opportunities for people. So the whole point of this is to build that network. There are a lot of very successful organizations around that have built a very comprehensive library of employer files and job skills inventories in their region. And there seems to be a significant correlation between their success in getting placements and job matches based on the number of relationships with employers they have and the number of data sheets. Now, there's not a lot of research around it, but I would say that there's enough evidence to demonstrate that it gives that support. So let's talk a little bit about the job skills inventory. So the job skills inventory is 56 items, and I think it's probably 56 of what one would call highly relevant items about success on a job. And as you can see, it's things like travel options, it's shifts available, weekly hours, the very basic stuff. This is very common sense. The job schedule, is it set, stable, moving, flexible? What are the attendance policies and practices? Can you work remotely? Those type of things are part of attendance. How important is it for the person to be prompt? Is there some flexibility about when the hours start or don't start? Acceptable appearance, is it okay? And some people say, well, don't you always have to have good appearance? Well, people that might want to choose a job at a recycling area might not have as high a demand as somebody that works in a restaurant. Receptive communications, and I'm not just talking about food and filth, I'm just giving examples of the range. Receptive communication requirements, being, receiving communication, expressing communication, peer interactions, supervisor interactions. And by the way, this tool is not geared towards just working with people with different types of impairment. This is an assessment of a job. In reality, when I'm hiring somebody for jobs, when I've ran organizations, it would not be uncommon for me to look at this tool just before I did that, to start thinking about what the job requirements were, even if there was a job description, because I really want to understand the elements of the job. Team participation, how do we work as a team? Then there's certainly environmental responses, lights, bells, whistles, simple stimulus, complex stimulus, hearing requirements, vision requirements. See, these are all common sense things that we would want to know about a job and are going to have a significant impact on who might be the right match to that job and what supports and interventions we provide. Vision, touch, tactile, people, decision-making, serving, assisting, sequencing. I'm going through it quickly, but I want people to get a feel for it. If you have questions about it, we can certainly talk about it more later. But pacing requirements, time, reading, written communication, arithmetic and math, and yes, there is a difference. Money skills, copying data, comparing objects, attention to task, technology, machine response, adjustment, stationary machines, driving, sitting, standing, upper body, lower body, lifting. One of the ones I want to get to, though, is layout, traffic of materials, people moving around, temperature in the environment. Was one time I did a assessment at a place that made golf tees. And I thought, well, that would be kind of a cool place to work. No, just the opposite. It's a very hot place to work. It's down the bottom of the factory, and they have these dowels that fit into these racks that look like that. And the job is to keep the dowels in, and the dowels go down and they're spun by a lathe. And the lathe will spin out about, I don't know, 100 of these tees within 20 minutes. So basically you're running up and down, filling the machine with dowels to make sure that the teas can go in. And it was probably in New England, it was a June day, and it was about 115 down in the bottom of that thing. So temperature was an interesting thing. And so let's go down further. Elements, weather, medications. Now, not medications the person is taking, medications that might be tolerated at that site, because some types of handling equipment and things like that require that you not be on certain types of medication. And if there's any other medical considerations, training, we've already talked about. This is a place where I really spend some time making sure that I understand what the training of new staff looks like, self-directed work, and then of course, salary range. Yes, 56 questions, but it isn't as overwhelming once you've done it a few times. Now, here's the good news. The right way to do it is that you sit down and you watch the job. And I've never really been able to watch a job in less than a half an hour. And I use this to help me understand and watch the job. When you've done this a couple of times, by the second or third time, you can easily complete the writing on this tool in a half an hour. So you can complete it. Now, here's the wrong way to do it. You go look at the job and then you go out in your car and fill out this tool. Now you just turned one job into two, and you've brought all these memory issues into play. So use the tool while you're there. You told the employer you had it, use it, be happy with it, comfortable with it, share it. There's nothing here secret. And then what we want to do is make sure that we read back over to make sure that somebody else who read this could do it. Because, you know, I might fill this out and then, you know, they change parties and I get a big job at the mayor's house or something, or a big job at the governor's house, and I'm not here anymore. But we want to make sure we still have all this documentation because we put the time and energy to go out and assess the job. So look at the job and fill it out. Now, here's one of the bad news elements of this tool. Once you get using this tool on a regular basis, your life will never be the same again. You will sit down in a restaurant, you will ditch a dry cleaning, you will go into somewhere and you will do a job skills inventory in your head unintentionally all the time. And then when you really get good at it, you'll start seeing inefficiencies in the way they're doing things and say, oh, they could do that faster, they could do that better. So that's unfortunately one of the things that changes your life, but that's exciting and fun. But this tool becomes a really important way to understand a job. Now, I even tell people when they're writing job descriptions, like even companies are writing job descriptions, this is a very good tool for them to use to help them at least frame their job description. They have the task, but these are the elements to frame it with. So this tool has multiple applications. So, okay. So now let's spend a little bit of time talking about gap analysis. I've talked about knowing the employer and knowing the person. This is the tool that brings it together. The gap analysis tool is probably the most important tool in the community-based employment process. If there's only one thing somebody takes away from the trainings that we do, where I do, I would hope it would be the use of the gap analysis tool, because it structures all the decisions that go into providing supports, sustaining supports, and communicating with all of the stakeholders. So let's talk a little bit about the gap analysis tool. There we go. The gap analysis tool and flowcharts and diagrams are really ways that we structure the support. Now, here's what the gap analysis can do for us. It can help us in the original job match decision. It helps us with the proposal to the employer, verbally and then in writing follow-up if we do. It helps us communicate any barriers that will come up during the job that we need to develop an intervention or support for, and it helps us communicate that to the participant, the employer, and the funding source, and the team. Excuse me. We also helps us provide the employment support plan for the person. Can also be a way to supervise staff and to provide feedback to staff. And it provides all the structure for all reporting. So let's talk about this tool. Sounds really fancy and cool, but it's pretty basic. But let's talk about how to use it. First of all, when you start thinking about the job, I said we have to know the job and the person in order to facilitate a job match. So we're going to want to make sure that we look at the job. And here's what the tool looks like. It's pretty straightforward. It's pretty basic. The first column is job expectations and requirements. The second column is the person's performance level or status. The third column is support strategies or interventions. You'll notice this is the fourth column there. That fourth column is really just for training purposes. In real life, that wouldn't be there. You'd want to just not have that, but I'll talk about why it's there and what we use it for. And then you would have the progress. So here's how the tool would be used. So I'm working on getting ready to make the proposal to the employer. I've looked at the job, I've looked at the person. And the job that I'm going to have us talk about is a job where it's in inventories. You guys know how stores do inventories? You know, they bring in an outside group. Well, the outside group comes in and does an inventory. And they have these little tools called guns, and they're component guns. And the idea is that when the employees come, they pick up a gun, they log it out, time logged out, and then they go do the work. If it breaks down, they don't want the person to be non-productive, so they bring the gun back, log out another one, and then the person repairs the gun and logs it back into the availability of the system. So the job is to repair the guns and log them out, log them in for repair, log them back out when they go out. So the job requires telling time to the minute. Okay. Now, If the person tells time to the minute, to the second, to the nanosecond, we don't have to write anything. We don't have a gap. Now, this doesn't mean that when we present to the employer, we're not going to focus on the person's strengths, but for the gap analysis, we're trying to find ways to overcome barriers. So this tool works on 1/2 of the presentation. Yes, we're going to talk about a person's strengths, but we're now talking on where there would be barriers or issues around employment that we would need to provide some support or intervention on. So a lot of people get all worked up when we start talking about this tool, and they said it only focuses on the negative. It's not focusing on the negative, it focuses on the areas where we're going to want to provide support. So that's the purpose of it. So we have a person that the job requires telling time to the minute. And we have a person who tells time to the hour. And as you see, there's a complete gap, telling time to the minute, telling time to the hour. That's a gap. You could also have other examples of gaps. One of the other examples is a person could tell time to the passages of daily activity. That's a gap also. Different gap might require different interventions. Or a person has no understanding of the passage of time at all. That's also a gap. Different gap, maybe different interventions. But does everybody see and understand that that constitutes a gap and what a gap is? So then when we have this gap, and there can be multiple gaps for a person, but we want to deal with one at a time. So we identify this is a gap for this person on this job. So then we want to think about interventions. Now, interventions primarily come in 3 families. One of the families is job restructuring. Job restructuring is where you add or delete tasks, change the sequence of tasks, or change the rules. You restructure the job. That's one intervention. It's family. Another family of interventions is job modifications. You physically change the environment or something in the environment, or you give the person an adaptive tool or technology of some type, or a physical adaptive tool, a jig of some type. Then the third type of intervention is called training. Now with training, I want us to be careful when we think about training as an intervention for gaps on a job. First of all, training, this is going to sound funny coming from a trainer, but training is probably the least permanent intervention on a job site. So therefore, I have some real concerns about training. And when you put training in, you don't just put training in. You put what type of training you're going to do. You're going to do systematic instruction with graduated assistants. You're going to do some type of errorless learning model. You don't just put training in, you put what type of training. The other thing about training is it's highly staff intensive. It's subject to great error. And as I said, it's the least permanent. And people go, what do you mean by least permanent? How many of you took a foreign language in high school? Do I need to talk more about the permanency of training if you're not using it all the time? So the reality is that training has some holes in it. I don't just think you don't want to train, but we have to understand that it has some gaps in it. So training does have some holes in it, but we might still choose it or some combination of the above. Now, there's always some training that goes on with a new job, but if there's a training that overcomes a gap. Now, the job coach is not an intervention. I frequently see people write the term job coaching here. Job coaching is not an intervention. It is a delivery vehicle for interventions. And we got to remember is we don't want the job coach here because that's between the job and the person. We want the job coach out as much as possible. So that we'll talk about the 4th column here in a second. So for this particular job, the organization decided that there were 2 possible options. One of the options was to use an iPhone with a verbal grid to document the billing. So when the gun would come in, the reader gun would come in, they would say gun number, read the number, and say it's in. That would automatically document time, and that they programmed it so that time would then go into a Excel chart. So they had a perfect reading of it. Or they talked about, well, they could use some type of a modification where they did one task for their coworker and their coworker did a task for them. That was another example. The one they chose was the iPhone. And actually it was such a really good choice that the organization that they were doing helping this person get a job for, after they saw it and used it a few times, they had all of the employees doing this job using the iPhone because it was so much more efficient. But anyway, so an example of the job modification, an example of job restructuring. So the one they chose was the iPhone. Right now, I have one of the elements of the proposal to the employer. Now, whatever else I identify becomes the proposal to the employer. So I've looked at your job and I have this person that would need, they have trouble telling time to the minute, but we've given them iPhone with a verbal grid that'll take care of it. Is that a support you'd be interested in exploring? The employer said, of course. And so then we had the person meet the employer. So see how this forms a proposal when you get all done. But just before we make sure that we're ready to make the proposal, that's when we look in this column. Remember the column I told you doesn't really exist on the real form? Right here. That column is, can we do it? And who's the we and can we do it? First of all, the person, and then the employer, and then us. We're the intervention of last resort. But we check to make sure that this intervention makes sense to everyone, and there's resources to do it. So this is where we do that little self-check for ourselves. Now, if it's a yes, we go on and look at other interventions, and people say, well, how many interventions could you have? You can have as many interventions as you can put yes to. There is a reasonableness as to how many you're going to do, but reasonableness is person by person, situation by situation. If you get a no, I always say you got to start with a little no, then have a big no. So if you get a no, I call it a little no at first. I got a no, so I'm going to go back and try to think of other interventions. Because you could take this tool and make a darn good argument why none of us belonged in our jobs. The reality is you want to use this tool to try to find a way to make it work. So if I get a little no, I go back and try to think about other interventions. But if I get a big no, I can't think of any interventions, I can't overcome this barrier, I get a big no, what do? Walk away. It's not a job match. It documents why I made the decision and how I made the decision, and it's not a job match. Don't get caught in the human services world of magic dust. Oh, but maybe if we did it for a while, it could work. No, if you can build an intervention and you can make it work, training, job modification, job restructuring, yeah. But if you can't do any of those and they can't meet it, and people say, well, what if we take that piece out of the job? Well, that's called job restructuring. So yes, that's an intervention. But if no intervention is going to work, no. Now, the other thing we're going to have happen is after we do make a match, we might identify things we didn't know about the person or we didn't know about the job. And those we got at them. Now, what happens if the person's been on the job for about 3 weeks and we get a little no that goes to a big no? We start facilitating with all the team members, the person, the employer, hey, we got a problem here. We're going to have to find a solution. Now, it isn't our job, so we can't fire the person, but we've got to start talking to them, say, hey, let's learn how to leave a job right. Give you notice, give 2 weeks notice, leave correctly. Looks good, that's good for the employer. Bang, the employer understands it, can't do that part of the job. Employer's happy. Person says, no, it's my job, I'm not going to leave. Okay, now we need to start doing damage control. We got to tell the employer, yeah, we'll support you. We know you're probably going to have to tell the person, give them, three written, the written warning, and then the verbal written, and then the third warning, and move them out. But we'll support them that, and we'll tell the person, look, they're going to move you through. And we tell the team, look, we're going to move you through. So that's the reality of that tool, how it helps there. So we do the can you do it, and they're all yeses. And you see an example, and I've just written in requirement and performance level and intervention, so you can see that they can have multiple elements to it. So the employer, I tell the employer, they say yes. I tell the person the employer would be interested in it. We set up the meeting. The employer hires the person. This is now gone from the proposal to the employer to becoming the support strategies. So if I'm the employment facilitator, I know that there are barriers. And so what I do is I walk out and I put a date at the top of the tool. So I put November 3rd, 2022. And I say, okay. And I go out that day and I start doing the interventions that I've identified. Maybe add some, but I put them right on here. But I do them. Now, when should a progress note be written? At the end of the time that we're there. Right at the end, just as you're leaving or while you're finishing up. You can do this without it being obtrusive and standing over people with a clipboard. In fact, I recommend these be on iPads or iPhones, and you can just pull in a few words. Now, the really cool thing about this tool is that a good progress note should say statement of the problem, strategy to intervene, effectiveness of the intervention. Now, I see a lot of people sitting around trying to figure out what to write on a progress note. Had a great day, things seem to be on track, things seem to be going well, is not a progress note. It is, in fact, a bad weather report. So the reality is that this provides a great structure for a note, and the person can look how few words they can write. Now, these notes that I have here, 2 of them are really good and 1 of them is bad. Can you figure out which one's bad? Of course. Continues to be very effective. You want observable and measurable. So these would be the observable and measurable elements. But look how little writing my employment support person had to do, and look at what a great report I have. Now, I'm there today and I do this. All of a sudden I get strep throat and I can't come in tomorrow, and Julia has to cover for me. She knows what I'm working on and how I work it. She doesn't come in and start all over. It doesn't come from scratch. She knows how we did. So that's how this tool works. And it coordinates that coordination amongst people that would be providing support. And it structures the reporting to the funding source. If I'm a funding source, this is the report I want. Now, people say, well, wait a minute, storybook continuation, Rick. Well, storybook continuation means that I can look at November 3rd. And on November 3rd, let's just assume one of the items I wrote in there is not maintaining standards. So on November 4th, I put in a different intervention, and then I write how that's going. We have storybook continuation from November 3rd to November 4th. Storybook continuation means that I can read one note and then the next note, see what's going on. It doesn't mean it has to be a narrative storybook format. And that's really a misunderstanding. The value of this to a funding source is incredible because they see what's being worked on and how it's going. The value within an organization is from one person to the next. Now, again, I've heard people say to me, well, Rick, we don't have time to do that. You're doing it, you just don't have time to write it. It only takes a few minutes to write it. So that doesn't hold water when people say that. Okay, so that's the tool and how to use it for the proposal, on-site support, and reporting. Now, the other use of this tool is that it could be used to supervise staff. In fact, whenever I supervise staff, I use a version of this tool because I want them to be comfortable with the formatting. So if I'm have an employment facilitator or a job developer or a coach or even a manager or a supervisor of some type that works for me, I'm going to have them do this tool. And this person is an example of one. The progress notes must be completed on time. And I had a staff member who progress notes are incomplete and they were coming in late. So we did a training on gap analysis format and one-to-one coaching sessions on what to put in and how to do it. But now see, because I use this to supervise my staff, and I can also use it for development, not just for corrective. I can, at the beginning of the year, sit down with my staff and say, okay, here's what you want to work on. You want to become a CESP certified. Okay, then not CSC certified. You're going to do this activity and you're going to challenge the exam at this time. And then each quarter or each month when I meet with you to do my supervision, we check to see how it's going. And at the end of a month or the end of a quarter, but at the end of the year, the person can also write their own performance review. So all the performance review work and all that stress everybody has, it's no longer a secret, and the work has been managed throughout. And staff like that because they feel like you're investing in them. They feel like you're communicating to them. So when we talk about turnover among staff, one of the things that we know about turnover and from management is that people usually leave jobs because of their managers and because of the structure of the environment. They will leave for pay, but they knew the pay when they started. So if they're unhappy throughout the process, there's a breakdown. This tool can be very powerful in helping people feel supported and help them feel like they know what's expected of them. Good communication of it.